Welcome to Physicians Who Lead, the podcast where we sit down with physician leaders who are shaping the future of healthcare. Each episode, we dive into the real challenges facing our system today and hear directly from the physicians leading the way with innovation, resilience, and vision. If you want to understand how healthcare is changing and meet the leaders driving that change, you're in the right place.
Welcome to the Physicians Who Lead podcast, the podcast where we talk with physicians who are shaping healthcare through leadership, innovation, mentorship, and service. I'm Kevin Kirkpatrick, founder of Avery Professional Group. Through our work supporting hospitals, medical groups, and healthcare organizations with physician and physician leadership recruitment, I've seen how important it is to identify, support, and retain strong leaders. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Laura Suttin. Dr. Suttin is a family physician, healthcare leader, certified coach, consultant, speaker, and author of The Purposeful MD. Her work focuses on helping physicians and healthcare organizations reconnect leadership, culture, and clinical work with purpose, connection, empowerment, and joy. This is an important conversation because physician leadership is not just about titles, it's about influence, alignment, courage, and creating environments where physicians and teams can do meaningful work without losing themselves in the process. Laura, welcome to the Physicians Who Lead.
Thanks for having me. Good to talk with you.
Thanks. I just started doing an introduction. I usually just jump right into it. So someone told me to do an intro, so now I have to listen to myself talk. Can you start off by sharing a bit about your path into medicine and how your career evolved from family physician to leadership to coaching, consulting, and writing?
Yeah. I've been out of residency for about 20 years now. So always wanted to be a doctor ever since, well, not always, but always really wanted to be in healthcare. And I wanted to make the most impact. And I felt like that was the way to do that was to be a physician. So went straight through undergrad to medical school to residency. I joined a small private practice out of residency. And a couple years later, my boss sold his practice. We had 2 or 3 clinics at the time to a larger health system. So I wasn't seeking out that level of a system, a practice, but I kind of fell into it. And once I joined, I started to make some operational shifts within my own clinic that caught the attention of leaders. And so I was invited to be a leader, and I can share a little bit of an aside on that journey in and of itself, but kind of rose through the ranks of leadership within the organization. And so I was balancing clinical and administrative work at the time. The administrative work I was doing was a lot of different things. Started out with looking at integrating our EMR. We were moving from disparate EMRs to one EMR, so I was leading that for a while. What I ended up doing for most of my time there was twofold: looking at our clinical operations, so leading our health and safety team, so all of our policies, procedures, infection control, regulatory, all of that. And then I was also leading a lot of clinician engagement initiatives, so culture, team development. That's really what got me into coaching. I was talking with a colleague who was seeking out a coaching certification back in 2019, and I didn't even know that was a thing. But I loved that aspect of it. Just like primary care is a lot of one-on-one relationship building with patients. I love that aspect of relationship building with my peers. And I was doing a lot of informal mentoring. I was kind of the one that people would call when they were upset about something and frustrated and just needed an ear or needed some advice. So got my coaching certification in 2020, started my own company. I was coaching internally within my system and externally too. And so left the health system, made the leap about 2 years ago. And I've been a full-time entrepreneur now for the past 2 years. Worked with a ton of clinician leaders. My own journey had so many bumps within clinician leadership. And I also saw what worked and what didn't work. And so that's been a passion of mine to help shape how our physicians are trained and taught about leadership and the skills that they're given. So that's the short version.
Awesome. How did your clinical experience shape the way you thought about leadership?
Well, so it's interesting because the skills that as physicians, the skills that we're trained with and the skills that we're rewarded for and the behaviors that we're rewarded for in in our training are counterproductive for us when we move into a leadership role. So an example is we're trained to not ask for help. We're rewarded for doing everything ourselves and putting ourselves last, ignoring our own needs. Just this tough it up, bootstrap mentality that once we move into leadership is c- it's not only is it unhelpful, it's detrimental. And so that was one of the things that I saw very clearly is I was just like a lot of folks tapped on the shoulder because I was a good clinician and asked to be a leader. And the thinking was, well, you're a good doctor, you'll be a good leader. And I ended up being a good leader, but I made a ton of mistakes along the way. And so one of my passions is working with leaders to really help to unlearn some of those bad habits that we learned in our training and relearn new habits that just aren't taught in traditional leadership MBA programs. How do we manage ourselves? How do we prep for a difficult conversation with a peer or somebody that's now our direct report and that used to be our peer? All of those things just aren't talked about enough.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've heard that repetitively on the podcast from a lot of different leaders where that transition needs a mind shift change. Even things like being able to how quickly processes move and things like that from being in the moment and fixing the deal, treating that patient right in that moment to how do we ensure that we treat thousands of patients right.
Yes.
And, often I find that, traditional education is great and it's needed. And I'm not about to say that coaching is a one or the other, but I think coaching fits a niche and a need that's not necessarily addressed because it's more about and how do we manage self
Yes.
and stuff like that. That's why we include it in all of our searches is that if I place this chief medical officer, they get 6 months of external coaching because it allows them to transition, to be supported through that because it is lonely at the top
Yes.
and stuff like that, right? So
Yeah.
when physicians hear the word leadership, they often think about formal leaders like chief of staff, medical director, chair, CMO. How do you define physician leadership?
I yes, great question because it's a topic of debate. I feel like all physicians are leaders, and because it doesn't have to be a formal title. You're seen as a leader in your community, whether you're in a small town, large hospital system, academic, whatever that is. Your your colleagues and your team sees you as a leader. The floor nurses, your medical assistants, the research colleagues, I mean, they all see you as a leader in that space. Your patients see you as a leader. And so I firmly believe that regardless of whether or not you have a formal title, all physicians are leaders and those leadership skills are universal. We're even leaders within our own homes and communities. I mean, most of us are managing households and raising children and so we're leading in that way too. So it's not just at kind of at work, but at home as well in the community. So I firmly believe that all physicians are leaders.
What leadership behaviors do you think are the most needed in healthcare right now?
So the ones that I see, so I think about this as like, I'm thinking of the negative of your question is what are the deficits I'm seeing? I'm seeing leaders that again have this mentality that I can't ask for help. If I ask for help, it's a sign of weakness. I should just be able to do everything myself. If I become vulnerable with another human being, then that makes me look weak. And that's just so that's the whole piece about managing yourself, right? And that's not something that we're taught in our traditional leadership training. We're just suck it up, get through it, just survival skills to get to the next level. And I would say that's a lot of the managing the self. And then there's the whole team dynamic management of it. How do you run a team? How do you delegate to an executive assistant or administrative role? How do you establish clarity when you're moving forward on a project? How do you run a successful meeting? I mean, all of those things are skills and they're learnable skills. I think that's what's exciting to me is that these skills they're teachable, they're learnable, there's some discomfort that comes along with it, but there's opportunity for all physicians to incorporate and embody some of these leadership skills.
Well, one of the things I've seen time and time again in healthcare, especially when it comes to physician leadership, is they promote physicians that are excellent clinicians into leadership roles. You've mentioned it; it happened to yourself as well. They're not often or always prepared or supported, and some are because of the organizations they're with. But I think a lot of organizations don't do the best job there. But what do you see as the biggest challenges in that transition?
So, three patterns that I've seen come up over and over again. I felt them all in myself and seen them in my clients. Overwhelm, isolation, and imposter syndrome. So, overwhelm is now, so for instance, what happened to me, I was literally handed a post-it note by my office manager and said that the president of the medical group at the time asked me to attend this physician leadership meeting at such and such date at such and such time at, next Wednesday at 7:30. She handed me a post-it note. He wants you there. And I said, well, does that mean I'm a leader? And she shrugged her shoulders. I guess so. So I didn't have the clarity that I needed to start to be successful in my role. So, and then my role was added on top of my full clinical load. I see this a ton of times in organizations that leaders to a lot of extent don't have the protected time that they need in order to lead successfully. And so you feel like you're doing two full-time jobs, and that's going to cause overwhelm and burnout. And let's face it, a lot of these top clinicians are already struggling with burnout. And that could be why they're performing so well, because they're high achievers already. It's like the adage about when you need something done, you ask a busy person because they're going to get it done. So these leaders become overwhelmed because there's too much to do, not enough protected time. Then the imposter syndrome creeps in where they start to question, am I cut out for this? Am I a good leader? I've got two full-time jobs. I'm failing at both of them. I wasn't meant to be here. Somebody else needs to be doing this. I shouldn't be in this leadership role, questioning everything. And then there's isolation, and you mentioned this, it's lonely at the top, is well, now the people that I used to go to lunch with and vent to, now they report to me. I can't go to them anymore. And everybody thinks I'm a suit, quote unquote suit. They think I've sold out. I'm on the other side. I'm admin now, and I don't care about what happens to my clinician peers. And none of those things are true by and large. They weren't true for me, but I was accused of selling out. And I see this so often I saw it so often in myself and in my clients. And then that overwhelm and imposter syndrome feeds the isolation, which then feeds the overwhelm and imposter syndrome. And that's why coaching and a community like that can be it's life changing. And that's why I love that you have that and include that in your programs, because and that isolation it just feeds itself until you have somebody, an objective person, to come in and say, first of all, this is really common, everything that you're experiencing, and it doesn't have to be this way. And there are things that you can do to break free from that overwhelm and isolation. But until you see it for what it is, it's hard to break free from.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of cultural things that need to happen within organizations. And I like that you brought up protected time, right? Because I've worked with numerous hospitals, some FQHCs and stuff like that to recruit leaders, and it can be anywhere from a zero point 0.2 FTE, which is like a day a week, up to a zero point 0.4.
Mhm.
Or sort of zero point 0.8, which is 4 days a week. But it's really hard to lead a 24/7 environment when you're not a full-time leader, right? And I understand the budgetary constraints, and not every hospital is big enough to need a full-time leader. I'm not suggesting that everybody leave clinical to become full-time leaders, but looking at support structures that are in place to allow them to leverage that time, that protected time well, and then supporting them with a culture that doesn't look towards a blame component. It looks towards, continual development, right? And and feedback in a safe, transparent, courageous way, right? And I think that's a big get. a big change. And to align that with the coaching is great. And I see that's become a major part of your work. What drew you to coaching, and why do you think it's so valuable?
Yeah, I definitely want to answer that. And I want to go back to what you said about protected time and just highlight that because I see this so often where a clinician leader might have four to eight or however many hours of admin time, but either that admin time is full of meetings and they can't get anything done, or nobody's covering their clinical practice while they're in that administrative role. And so maybe they're sitting in their clinic in their office and maybe they have the door closed, maybe not, but they're responding to patient messages. They're getting their inbox, like the MA is knocking on the door. Hey, this patient needs this. They're taking walk-ins, all of that. And that is really detrimental to that leader's role as a leader. They need boundaries and they need that levels of support. So absolutely just want to really emphasize that. What drew me to coaching, I I'd been coached myself. I started working with a coach pretty early on. I was assigned a coach as part of a leadership development program and phenomenal. Somebody I still work with to this day. And I saw the power of coaching in a way that I hadn't seen through any other mentorship or leadership training or even counseling. And we know coaching is not mental health treatment, can be a fantastic add on for somebody who is undergoing mental health treatment. It just had an impact on me in a way that was incredibly powerful. And as much as I enjoyed even taking the call from a clinician peer who's frustrated and struggling and doesn't know what to do, just to be able to hold that space and to help to bring forth the insights that come out through coaching. And that's one thing I love about coaching is that it's not about me. It's not about like, well, I'm going to mentor you and show you the way it's done. The coach holds space and the coach asks powerful questions and allows the inner wisdom of the client to come through in a way that is more powerful than any mentorship relationship than I've ever been a part of. And so just the ability to watch, it's like I'm sitting back and watching the beauty unfold in a coaching environment is it's magic.
Excellent. And you know what? And it's like I've been recruiting for 25 years. I consider myself an expert, but it's easy to learn the new AI tool or whatever, right? It's different to look at how I show up to work every day and how my tendencies affect me and, my imposter syndrome and those different aspects, right? So you know, it's it's interesting, and I think coaching can look at a lot of different aspects beyond just the how do you talk to your CEO, how do you develop your guidelines for your board and stuff like that. But one of the major themes in your work is helping physicians reconnect with purpose and building a life in medicine that aligns. That to me is such a something that we should be striving for a lot of our clinicians to do because it's the only way to make healthcare sustainable. Talk to me a bit about how you do that without giving away the secret sauce, but how do you align them?
Yeah. A lot of clinicians that I've worked with, depending on your journey and everybody's path is different, but there's a common theme of at some point when I'm young, I would decide I want to be a doctor or a nurse or, physician assistant or whatever that path is. And it's so many steps to get there. And so a lot of times we look back at once we've made it, right? We've finished our training, now we're in a job or whatever that looks like and we kind of are like, okay, well that was great. Now what? It's that arrival fallacy of,
Mm,
well, I had this in my mind, this vision that once I finish my training, everything's going to be great. And that just doesn't happen. And so because we bring our same fears and tendencies and beliefs and whatever our kind of our work, our junk with us. And so we bring our baggage. I was looking for that word. We bring our baggage with us. And so a lot of times clinicians lose sight of their purpose. And when that happens, everything, it's almost like the foundation underneath you is completely gone. And you think about clinicians in this time in their lives, they're starting families and maybe caring for relatives elderly relatives, grandparents, parents, that kind of thing. Like all this messiness of life starts to become this existential question of, well, what is this? What is this all for? What am I here for? What am I doing? That's when the burnout can come in. And so reconnecting with whatever your core values are. So what is it the life, and I love doing this work with clients. What is it about your life that you love doing? What is it about your life that you don't like doing? What's the impact that you want to make? How do you want to design your life? And then let's create the subtitle of my book is creating the life you love without guilt. Let's not retrofit your life to meet what's already there. Let's build this life that you love so that you don't have to ask yourself these questions every single day. So I've experienced that for myself, and I've seen it in so many clients, and not just physicians. A lot of people in professional and other types of work have experienced this as well. And asking ourselves those questions, going back to what are your core values and what does this all mean, can also be life changing.
It's interesting because I've been running the company for 18 years, and there have been changes in how I do the business over the years, and sometimes it seems like it aligns with kind of what I feel like impact should be, right? Or what that wants to be. And I remember I started clinically recruiting physicians and realizing that, like there's communities where I've put multiple physicians and, 5,000 people now have a doctor that they didn't have before, or a hospital has an anesthesiologist. So they're not losing sight of their OR lists and stuff like that. But the problem I have and is that I'm starting to watch the toll that that's taking on the physicians. And I struggle with that because when your motivation is to make impact and put someone in a good spot, it's really hard to sit here and say, okay, I'm going to put you into a position and you're going to struggle because of the system itself, not because of you or your efforts, but because of the system. So I guess about 18 months ago is when I started the podcast, and it was as a result of, helping a couple of organizations find physician leaders. And then I talked to other physician leaders, and I believe, and maybe I'm naive, but I believe that investing in physician leaders and other clinical leaders, because I do work outside of just physicians, but investing in those leaders will then allow us to support them, which then innately allows them to support the clinicians and change the system and change the cultures and the environments instead of just trying to recruit more physicians and putting them into the existing thing. I feel like this is my way of advocating and changing the system, right? And that to me is a lot more fulfilling, right? Because I'm not a money motivated guy. I mean, if I was money motivated, I would have stayed away from healthcare and I would have been in one of the other industries I worked in where I made more money. But I really like working with physicians. I really like working with nurses and people that run towards the challenges and not away from them and stuff like that. So knowing my long-winded comment here, but from my side of the work, recruitment and retention are severely connected, right? And in some cases, unfortunately, disconnected, and systems are broken and things like that. But how do you think organizations should approach physician retention differently?
Yeah, I was just talking about this with a client this morning, actually, with a consulting client on really just the beginning stages of how do we look at turnover? How do we look at retention? Recruitment and retention are two sides of the same coin, right? A lot of people think, well, if I'm retaining my clinicians, then I don't really need to have a recruitment strategy. And I would disagree with that because you if you want to grow, you still need to recruit. And so this client put it beautifully is we want our recruitment to be because of growth and not because we're losing people. And that's the place that you want to be in. So measuring it, we have to measure it, right? What does our time to fill look like? If it's 12 to 18 months to fill up a physician position, that's a very, very, very expensive problem. It costs an average of $500,000 to $1 million for one physician to be replaced in one organization. And so if you think about the probably about 3 or 4 years ago, kind of coming out of COVID, we were seeing this shell game of physicians just moving around, moving around, moving around across the country, and physician turnover was really high. And that's an expensive problem. There's a ton of indirect costs, and I can go into that in more detail if you want, but it starts with knowing the numbers. Where are you? Where do you want to get to? And then almost like identifying, yes, there is a problem. I have yet to find an organization that doesn't have some target where they want their turnover to be lower than where it is. I mean, most organizations that I've talked to want to do something about it. And so that's a lot of the work that I do is what are the structural causes of clinician turnover?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I've worked internally at 3 hospitals as well, and I've worked at hospitals where the attrition rate was really high, and a lot of it was the geography they were in. It was just so easy to switch jobs that if somebody got a better schedule, off they went. So that had cultural, organizational. It was an indicator of organizational challenges. I've also worked at a hospital where the attrition was super low. However, their culture wasn't great, and the reason for the low attrition was that you were an hour to an hour and a half away from the next hospital. So, people that lived in the community didn't want to switch because it meant either moving or commuting an hour and a half.
Mhm.
So people can stay and be miserable, and that doesn't really help us get to where we need to be either, right? So one of the things I think I read either on your site or somewhere was about leading with courage and clarity. And healthcare is complicated. It's got,
Mhm.
uncertainty, competing priorities, there's difficult conversations and stuff like that. How can physician leaders stay grounded when they don't have all the answers?
That's a huge aspect of going back to what I was saying before about how physicians are trained versus the skills that are required for leadership. So we're trained to be certain. I mean, there's this process that I don't know if it still goes on because I'm old enough, but in medical school on rounds or residency, it was called pimping, where you would just get, yeah, that was the word for it, was pimping. You get pimped. Your attending would just fire questions at you.
Okay.
And it was nerve wracking. My heart rate is going up thinking about it because you've ever seen this show Scrubs? I don't know if you've ever watched that show. So that's when all of them are on rounds, and then Dr. Kelso and what was the other one's name? I can't remember, but he would ask, the intern of the day, what are the three main causes of X, Y, or Z? That's what it is. And it's intended to be nerve wracking. So we have that mentality of, I better know the answer and I'd better have it by 5:30 a.m. on rounds. And if I don't know, and if I say I don't know, I'm going to look stupid. I'm going to get a bad grade on this exam and this rotation. My attending's not going to give me the good cases. I mean, all of these, I'm not going to get the residency or the fellowship that I want. And so not knowing the answer is a huge fear for a lot of physicians.
Mm.
Now you translate that to leadership and there's so much uncertainty. And the leader's job isn't to know everything. That was a hard lesson for me to learn was it's not my job to know everything that my team is doing and to know all the answers because I'm not going to be getting pimped anymore. But my job is to know where to find it, first of all, and to keep the bigger picture in mind because each of my team members is seeing small parts of the organization but I need to keep the bigger picture in mind. I need to keep that connection to the larger organization. What's that connection to the mission? How does our work connect to the mission? And so leading or dealing with that uncertainty is really, really hard for physicians. And that can kind of goes back to managing the self. How do I manage my nervous system when I come up on a question I don't know? So
It's interesting, and I've led teams of up to 10 or 12, and normally the organization is sliced into 10 or 12 groupings, right? So then you're trying to, my job is to see what's happening across all 12 and identify themes and look for forward thinking solutions and, where do we go next? And then developing the people underneath you so
Yes.
that I always, I'm not one for saying staying somewhere. I was never somewhere for staying somewhere long. So my philosophy was always like, how do I train my replacements?
Right.
Or how do I train people to go elsewhere? And I think some of my biggest wins in my career when I worked internally were, the number of people that got promoted, right, and into larger roles, and some into more diverse roles, and I took a lot of pride in that, right? So, and I think that that's what we need more of, and you talk a lot about managing self and stuff like that, and I hear a lot from physician leaders that the transition from, I have to fix something in here and now. Right. And this, this is more, I haven't seen as much on the US side because I've never worked inside a US hospital, only externally, but in Canada, a lot of emerge physicians are leaders. And because, a full-time emerge doc works 12 shifts a month. Right. So they have a lot more time. And sometimes that transition is challenging because you're used to stabilizing and moving along, stabilize, move along, or stabilize, move inpatient, stabilize, move home. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, now you have to look at an EMR implementation that's going to take 6 months, and just the pace and the flow of information and the flow of relationships, is drastically different, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
There's Yeah, and I mean, I'm primary care and clearly different than emergency medicine, but it's yeah, one patient at a time. I'm going to deal with the patient that's in front of me, and then I'm going to close their chart, finish their note, close their chart, go to the next patient, and so yeah, with a project like that, you're dealing with a long timeline. You have multiple stakeholders at different levels of engagement, right? And because if you have one patient okay, this patient is at this level of awareness and engagement, and my next patient's at it's one-on-one transactions. Leadership is one to many, different stages of engagement, different stages of awareness, knowledge, all of that, longer timelines, a lot of unknowns, and it can be really, really tricky and cause a lot of impatience and a lot of frenetic activity. That's kind of what I was saying, going back to that balancing the administrative and clinical. I remember I had a client that had moved into a COO role. He was a physician assistant. And he was like, "Yeah, I'm putting out fires over email while I'm in clinic." And I was asking him, "Well, what are these types of fires that you're putting out?" And it came down to he was seeing everything as an emergency. Every time an email came into him, he went into fight or flight because he thought it was an emergency and that he had to fix it right then and there. And so and part of it was he was trained in the military too. And so he had that kind of, I got to get to this mission right now. So we worked through some of that. How do you not see every email that comes in as an emergency? How do you even not see it as something that you need to specifically fix? That's something I'm working on with a client right now, that she's trained in this, so I have to fix it for them. And the person that's reaching out to her is usually, there's lots of layers in between her and this other person, and what it turns out is happening is she's denying her direct reports, her team, the opportunity to lead and fix it on their own and showcase what their work is. And so it's very interesting how it all shows up.
yeah, interesting. So my last question is more of asking for advice for people that might be listening, but for a physician listening who may be interested in leadership, coaching, advocacy, or building something beyond their clinical role, what advice would you give them?
So definitely working with a coach, I absolutely advocate for 100%. One thing that I see in physicians is this kind of stuck fixed mindset. Well, I can't do that because of this, and or I can't do X because of whatever. And we're incredibly intelligent, resourceful, resilient human beings, and we can do just about anything that we want. And so follow your dream, follow your heart. I know that sounds trite and cliched, but I see so many physicians that, well, I can't do this because I'm clinical here, or just putting barriers in place that don't need to be there. And so be open to exploring possibilities. And again, that's where a coach can be incredibly helpful.
My last question, a little bit philosophical. How can they explore leadership without losing connection to who they are as a physician and as a person?
Well, my leadership program dives into all of that. So happy to share more about that. But leadership is becoming more of who you are, and I think that's what's beautiful about it. Is it's not a well, I'm a clinician and then I become a leader and I'm moving away. You're moving more towards your true nature and your true self. There's a reason you're in the role. Um, it's a huge learning opportunity, a huge area for growth and personal and professional development. And I think it's the best journey for anybody to be on.
It's interesting because a lot of the physicians I talked to over the last 18 months, it is mission driven. Like it is innately, and maybe that's just the people that, that have agreed to be on the podcast, but it's aligned with the notion of trying to fix more things. And I've heard numerous times that, well, instead of, impacting my roster of patients, I can impact the system. I can impact more people. And I think that's heavily tied with, intrinsic goals and stuff like that. So I think, in some cases, I do think physicians become the leader because they were the last one to the meeting, or they put their hand up the slowest and stuff like that. And I think we need to fix the structural things that lead to that being the choice. And that's kind of what I'm advocating for. But it has been a pleasure speaking with you. And,
Too.
I'm not a physician, but a lot of the things, excuse me, that you mentioned have actually resonated with me, around finding yourself and your purpose and stuff like that. So where can people find your book?
So my book is on Amazon, bookshop.org, anywhere you can buy books. So it's called The Purposeful MD, Creating the Life You Love Without Guilt. So yeah.
So, well, listen, thank you very much for joining the Physicians Who Lead podcast. Anyone listening, thank you for spending time with us. If this conversation resonated with you, please share with a physician, healthcare executive, or emerging leader you want to benefit from it. I'm Kevin Kirkpatrick, and this has been Physicians Who Lead.